Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today, I want to take you to an open field about 75 miles west of Richmond, Virginia, after midnight on April 7th, 1865. Imagine the embers of a campfire of fence rails glowing, and nearby, an ambulance is parked. Around, you can see shadowy forms of orderlies just visible in the darkness. You can hear the occasional neighing of horses in the distance. A slight breeze is blowing on this cool spring night. One figure is visible. He's a tall man in a gray uniform with a gray beard to match. It's General Robert E. Lee, and he stands next to the ambulance, one hand resting on the wheel of the wagon. He's speaking softly yet directly as he dictates orders to his military secretary, John Marshall. His eyeglasses might be catching the glint off of the lamp and the lap desk upon which he's working as he sits uncomfortably in the ambulance. He's writing out Lee's orders. It had not been a good day. Earlier, at Sailor's Creek near Farmville, the Confederate Army suffered massive losses, around 7,700 captured, and an unknown number killed and wounded. The battle at Sailor's Creek was the culminating event of a week of devastating losses that had begun with the evacuation of Richmond on April 2nd and its occupation by U.S. forces the next day. The Confederates had fired warehouses as they left, leaving a significant part of the business district in smoking ruins. The war was over, and Lee knew it. Mostly everybody knew it. As Lee dictated orders to Marshall, a young man, 18-year-old John Sergeant Wise, a second lieutenant in the Army of Northern Virginia, armed only with a Colt revolver and on horseback, showed up. He'd been searching for General Lee all day, evading Union patrols along the way and coming within a hair's breadth of being captured. Yet he continued the search, and finally it paid off. Young Wise carried an update from General Henry H. Walker, who was the head of the now defunct military department of Richmond. The orders were really more of an update as to what was going on, and it was on a form that was pre-signed by Jefferson Davis. The news was bad. Young Wise talked about the contents of the order and what that evening was like, and an unusual conversation, a candid conversation he recalled General Lee having with him. The anecdote he was sharing in his 1899 memoirs, The End of an Era. Let me share it with you now. It begins like this. It was past midnight when I found General Lee. He was in an open field north of Rice's Station and east of the High Bridge. A campfire of fence rails was burning low. Colonel Charles Marshall sat in an ambulance with a lantern and a lap desk. He was preparing orders at the dictation of General Lee, who stood near, with one hand resting on a wheel and one foot upon the end of a log, watching intently the dying embers as he spoke in a low tone to his amanuensis. That's another word for a scribe or military secretary, someone taking dictation. Touching my cap as I rode up, I inquired, General Lee? Yes, he replied quietly, and I dismounted and explained my mission. He examined my autograph order from Mr. Davis and questioned me closely concerning the route by which I had come. He seemed especially interested in my report of the position of the enemy at Burkeville and westward to the south of his army. Then, with a long sigh, he said, I hardly think it is necessary to prepare written dispatches in reply. They may be captured. The enemy's cavalry is already flanking us to the south and west. You seem capable of bearing a verbal response. You may say to Mr. Davis that, as he knows, My original purpose was to adhere to the line of the Danville Road. I have been unable to do so, and now I am endeavoring to hold the South Side Road as I retire in the direction of Lynchburg. Have you any objective, General? Any place where you contemplate making a stand? I ventured timidly. No, he said slowly and sadly. No, I shall have to be governed by each day's developments. Then, with a touch of resentment and raising his voice, he added, a few more sailors' creeks, and it will be all over. It ended, just as I've expected it would end from the first. I was astonished of this avowal to one so insignificant as I. It made me an insight into the character of General Lee, which all the books ever written about him could never give. It elevated him, in my opinion, more than anything else he had ever said or did. It revealed him as a man who had sacrificed everything to perform a conscientious duty against his judgment. He had loved the Union. He had believed secession was unnecessary. He had looked upon it as a hopeless folly. Yet, at the call of his state, he had laid his life and fame and fortune at her feet and served her faithfully to the last. After another pause, during which, although he spoke not a word and gave not a sign, I could discern a great struggle within him, he turned to me and said, "You must be very tired, my son. You have had an exciting day. Go rest yourself and report to me at Farmville at sunrise. I may determine to send a written dispatch." The way in which he called me my son made me feel as if I would die for him. So there you have the anecdote written by John Sergeant Wise, second lieutenant and an aide in the Army of Northern Virginia, his experience after midnight on April 7th, 1865, with General Robert E. Lee. Important to note that at the time Wise wrote this in 1899, Lee had been dead for the better part of 3 decades, and Lee's name, Lee's figure, the reputation of Lee had soared to an almost godlike height. So revered was he as a figure. And so Wise's story is written at that moment in time when Lee is just gleaming as the figure, the leader of the Confederacy, who seemed like he would live forever, at least in the hearts and souls of the Confederate soldiers who followed him. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War, a Research Trail.